Welcome to Stratford Literary Festival. My name's Caroline Sanderson. I'm a writer and books journalist. Our Stratford Literary Festival was, of course, so disappointed to have to cancel this spring's festival due to the COVID-19 outbreak, but instead we're absolutely delighted to bring you a taster of some of the events that would have been staged round about now. And so a very warm welcome to Stratford Goes Virtual. Readers are used to exercising our imaginations, so I want you to make believe that we're all spending some time together on a sunny day in May in beautiful Stratford upon Avon. And the beauty of this is that you don't have to be anywhere near Stratford to do it. With me at a safe distance here are two memoirists whose books focus on women's lives through intensely personal reflection. And what's more, in their different ways, both these books tell you, to borrow some of Lennie's words, how it felt to be there. So, how can I describe you, Clover? In the black jumper and glamorous necklaces is Clover Stroud, described by Bryony Gordon as a remarkable woman and an incredible writer, description with which I agree. Clover is a writer and journalist and the mother of 5 children. My Wild and Sleepless Nights, a mother's story, is her second slice of memoir, and it's quite something. In the Bookseller, I wrote that it left me reeling with empathy and admiration at the cargo it unloads of stress, chaos, uncertainty, sleeplessness, boredom, pain, grief, despair, joy, and boundless maternal love. So welcome, Clover. Tell us how you're doing and how you're managing, and whether you're actually managing to do any reading, writing, anything book related at all.
Thank you very much for having me here. It's lovely to see you, and it's lovely to be part of this. Yes, it's been, I found the last few weeks really quite extraordinary. It is an extraordinary time, but in terms of my kind of relationship with my children, I'm very, very interested by the way lockdown forced us into this very close relationship with your children, but it also completely liberates you from much of the stress of endless school runs and rushing around and making packed lunches and the lost permission slips and the lost homework and the lost shoes and the lost swimming kit. And that has been a real relief, actually. But and I'm lucky because my children are 19 and 16, and then 7, 5 and 3, and so the elder 2 have been absolutely brilliant, and I'm paying them, but they're doing lots of my son is an art student. He's been doing lots of art lessons and things with them, and so I've got sort of inbuilt help with the kids, which is brilliant. But I have found, and I've been doing some journalism. I'm writing a big piece for the Sunday Times magazine at the moment. But I'm also supposed to be writing a proposal for a new book, and I am finding that deep, long form thinking is quite hard to do at the moment. It's quite hard to kind of get into that kind of almost it's not trance-like, but like that deeply meditative state, I think, where you are fully connected to your subject, and it's there all the time. Because at the moment my days are so broken up, and like everybody, there's the kind of anxiety and uncertainty and obsession with the news, and so I think it's difficult to write at the moment. I think this is a difficult time. There was a lot said to start with, like, use this time to write that novel you've been meaning to. I think that puts an awful lot of pressure on people at a difficult time anyway.
Yeah. Well, also with me in blue and yellow is Lennie Goodings. Lennie is chair of legendary UK publishing house Virago Press. In fact, I carefully arranged myself, so there's a whole little wash here of, I think it's Elizabeth Taylor.
Thank you.
Lennie was born in Canada and came to London in her early 20s and has remained there ever since, working with books and authors, among them such stellar names as Margaret Atwood, Maya Angelou, Sarah Waters, Marilynne Robinson, and many more is, she says, her passion, a passion she writes about in her memoir, A Bite of the Apple, A Life with Books, Writers and Virago. And in the Bookseller, I described it as a marvellous celebration of writing of reading and of publishing, and said it was the best book I've read on the art of publishing since Diana Attill's Stead.
Thank you.
So welcome, Lennie. Same
you.
question to you, really. How are you getting on? How are you faring?
Well, my children are grown and left home, so I don't have the homeschooling. But I find it's a bit like Clover said, actually. I find it very difficult to concentrate. And the first feeling was, oh my God, all this time, I should think of another book to write, or, I should be hunkering down, editing the ones I'm doing. And I found myself very skittish, kind of. In fact, what I'm mostly doing is reading some poetry, actually, or short stories I've discovered too are very good. But I keep, I find it hard to settle. I think if somebody had said you're going to have 8 weeks at home, then, possibly we would have organized our brains differently. Do you think? We don't know what tomorrow is going to be like, and yet oddly it feels just like yesterday too. The sameness is kind of curious. Having said all that, I don't have children at home. I have a nice garden. I'm lucky. I'm very conscious of the fact that some people are really, really suffering or having to work very hard. And some people it's just like putting life on pause. And I would say I'm more on the pause department. And because I work with authors and books, I can do an awful lot by Zoom and by email anyway. So, some things are not too terribly changed.
Absolutely. So let's talk about your books. Lennie, why did you decide to write your memoir as just that, a personal memoir? You could, after all, have written a very lively but much less sort of personal history of Virago.
Yeah, well, I discovered, this is why I call myself the accidental memoirist, because I didn't intend to write a memoir. It'll be interesting to know whether Clover set out that way too. I didn't intend to write a memoir. What I thought I would do is write about certain things I've been thinking about publishing over these years. Feminist publishing, the history of feminist publishing, how Virago fit within that. I've got one chapter called The Intimacy of Editing, because I do really, really love to edit and work very closely with creative writers. So I had all these bits. And then I realized that the only way to do it was to take the advice I would give an author, which is to do what's unique to me. So what is unique to me is I'm there. I have been there. I don't have to write about it from a distance. So then I realized, okay, I need to put myself into the story. And then I was very reluctant because it's a big story. It's all those writers you just discussed. It's all the people who've worked for Virago. There's over 100 people. I didn't found it. I'm sort of second generation. So I was very cautious in the sense of not overclaiming, my position within this fabulous company. And then I realized I can't, you have to, you have to leap in. I will be interested to hear what Clover says about being honest as well. You have to put yourself in. You have to open up. You have to, I've shared some things there that were hard in terms of working at Virago. I mean, I haven't talked about my own family life or anything like that, but, office life is most of us spend most of our lives there. It's all, it's more than 50% of our lives, isn't it? So I realized I had to inhabit that very emotionally. So it turned into a memoir.
I mean, that's interesting. It's interesting you talk about the uniqueness of it, because in a sense, Clover, being a mother is far from unique, and even having 5 children is not unique. So what was it that you really wanted to do with this, thinking of yourself as a writer as well as a mother?
I mean, I think the honesty that Lennie was talking about is the thing that kind of drove me. I love motherhood and I hate motherhood as well. It is the thing that makes me happiest, and it is the thing that makes me most unhappy. And I had my 5th child, and I felt as kind of enraptured, enraged. One of them outside, sorry now, and deranged by motherhood as I ever had, essentially. And I started talking to women, actually, my friends, and on social media about it. And I really wanted to communicate what the kind of extremities of it were like, really. And I wanted to know whether the extremities were normal, as it were, whether it was a shared experience by many other women. And the more that I talk to other women, the more that you hear people saying, yes, I find it incredibly difficult, or I've had invasive thoughts when I had a newborn baby about harming my baby or harming myself, or sometimes I just want to walk out of the house and leave, or just drive off from the school run and never come back again. And I think to be able to communicate that and to share that felt really important to me. And there are memoirs around motherhood, but I couldn't specifically find anything. Rachel Cusk's book is obviously like the sort of big one that comes to mind, but that came out when my now 19-year-old was a baby, and I hadn't read anything very contemporary, immediately contemporary, which sort of got to the spiritual heart of it as well, the kind of horror of it and the kind of absolute beauty of it too, because there's quite a lot written about, oh, my toddler's so irritating, and women being, I think this is thanks to Instagram, women being more open about it. But I wanted something which kind of got that sort of spiritual mash of the darkness and the light, and that was what was sort of motivating me really to articulate that and to explore it within myself, and also to share it with other people.
You make that feel really important to do. And I've got a quote here from Lennie's book. I think you're quoting the editor Donna Coonan here, Lennie, and you say, I take the view that she says, I take the view that a small canvas is not necessarily an unambitious one. What is seen under the microscope can reveal much about the world in which we live, and what skill it takes to write observantly, feelingly, with wit and perception about the everyday, relationships, families, children, love. These are not marginal. On the contrary, they are life itself. It's very powerful, that really, and it just gives the lie to that sense that, kind of writing about what's, that the kind of life story that you're writing, Clover, is unimportant or unambitious.
No, I think it feels sort of increasingly important at the moment, and a lot of maternal life is obviously, it's rather like lockdown actually. I felt that the entire nation and large parts of the globe were getting the experience of what it's like to have a newborn baby, which is never to go out, to be incredibly bored, incredibly tired, never have any good clothes, no chance of getting your hair cut, and wanting to eat and sleep all the time. And it does feel important to kind of make that role, that domestic, that maternal role, visible. That feels incredibly important because it is such a huge part of being, it can be such a huge part of being a woman, and yet it is something which hasn't really been given the kind of literary credibility and space on the page which I think it deserves.
Why don't you read us a little bit from My Wild and Sleepless Nights?
So this is so the book, I when I was heavily pregnant with Lester, who you might just have heard wailing in the corridor a moment ago, who's now 3, my son Jimmy was I was sort of 39 weeks pregnant, and my son Jimmy, who's now 19 and an absolute delight, was expelled for smoking weed in school and having weed in school. Normal, kind of absolutely normal adolescent adventures and so on. But this bit I'm going to write now was just after he'd just been expelled. We'd found a new school for him. Lester was a very, very small newborn baby. And I thought, okay, maybe I can just relax right now and enjoy this, my little baby. And I was clearing up the garden, and at that point, a police car arrived outside my house, where I live in the middle of the countryside. So this is chapter 4, Playing with Knives. Before I had children, or at least when I was pregnant for the first time, before Jamie was born, and later into his early childhood, this is what I imagined. My children will only play with wooden toys. My children will start foreign language lessons when they're 4. My children will not shout in cafes. I will never shout at my children in cafes. I will never hit my children. My children won't eat sweets before they're 5. My children will eat fruit and vegetables every day. My children will always say please and thank you. My children will never ignore adults. My children will learn at least one musical instrument each. I will read to my children every night. I will teach my children to read fluently before they start school. I will teach my children all their times tables off by heart. My children will never swear at me. I will never swear at my children. I will always love my children. I've failed at all of these, apart from one. And when the policeman is asking for me, I realise that I'm failing at lots more newer, different things too. My failings are growing to match the size of my children. Because when I held newborn baby Jimmy, I never saw a policeman in our future. I saw chubby legs, baby grows, sippy cups and wooden toys, cardboard reading books, packed lunch boxes, bunk beds, school shoes, a family-sized tent, a school bag and a pencil case full of scented pencils. I never saw this, or this completely new feeling of being conflicted about my role in all this, about what my role in all this is. The policeman, whose uniform makes him look a bit like one of the Playmobil toys Dash and Evangeline leave on the kitchen floor for me to tread on barefoot, stands in front of me and is talking to me. I can tell immediately from his stance and a slight softness in his face that nothing really awful has happened. Jimmy isn't hurt, no one is dead, but still a policeman. So as I watch his mouth moving, it's as if my brain has frozen in a single moment of sound and motion, like the shuttered slam of seats being flipped upwards in a deserted auditorium. I raise my eyebrows and smile at him with my lips pressed hard together. But none of this feels right. Should I be smiling at him like this? Should I smile with my teeth or with my lips shut? At this moment, I do not know how to rearrange my face or how it is I'm supposed to be as a mother. None of the baby books suggested that this was coming rushing up on the horizon. And although the policeman arriving is a surprise, it's not a terrible shock. Because what I'm trying to accept as my children get older is that motherhood is a drama that I will act out every single day, every day. I don't suppose that this will be the last policeman in my life. Often in the course of a single morning, a single hour, motherhood will take me to a place when I feel this is the end of my tether. This place right now in the mess and chaos is when I snap. This place is all I can take. This is my limit. I'm at the end of my tether, I'll scream at the children, slamming a pan into the sink in an attempt to scare them into obedience. Or I'll wail at my sister, I can't take any more. Please, please come over. I'm at the end of my tether. Or I'll text Pete, my husband, when are you home? End of my fucking tether. Being a mother pushes me unwillingly into parts of my mind that I didn't know existed before I had children.
Thank you so much. You have just amazing ability to, and as I mentioned at the beginning of this, capture how it felt and absolutely how it felt. And anyone who's been a mother will, just recognise so much of that.
Yep.
This idea, Lennie, of trying to capture how it felt. I think Clover has the most incredible, vivid descriptions of pregnancy and birth. Things that are vivid to me, but also feel very blurry. In terms of the recall about the things that you're writing about and trying to capture how that felt, how did you go about that in your memoir? Did you have, just in the simplest way, did you have diaries or a physical record of any kind?
I didn't. I wish I'd kept diaries, and everybody, that famous phrase, keep a diary and the diary will keep you. I should have done that. But I could remember, it's funny, it's actually fun. Someone like Maya Angelou would talk about this when she was writing Caged Bird. And she said, you put yourself back there and it's just extraordinary once you start writing, I find. If you just talk, not necessarily, but writing, I could suddenly see myself in that room. I could suddenly see what were the posters on the wall, what was how the light came in, all sorts of things. And once you've sort of situated yourself again, you remember so many things. The one thing I found difficult though, and this is, I'll be so interested, Clover, you can revisit motherhood when your kids are all grown. Because the one thing you can access your brain that says, I felt disturbed, I felt happy, or, or frightened, I was sometimes. That intellectually, but it's very difficult to access the feeling again, the actual feeling. And then my mother turned up in the middle of a holiday. I went back to Canada and we went to Peely Island where Margaret Atwood has a cottage, and she said to us, come and it's a great place to be. Anyway, so off we went. And my mom turned up with letters that I had written to her in my early days at Virago. And in it was some really searing stuff. And there were those sentences I was looking for, you know, which was how it felt to be a young person in a place that was, you know, on the edge, wanted to succeed, you know, was in the middle of something incredibly exciting politically, but, you know, which, you know, not, it was hard on some of us. It was hard on the staff, it has to be said. And there it was, you know, so I was grateful to have actual letters. But no, I didn't keep diaries.
Go on, Clover.
I think it's such a good, I'm so interested by what you've just said, Lennie, because that thing of, as you're, when, you know, we could talk about what can you remember about your childhood or student or whatever. In conversation, it can be blurry and not precise, but there is a kind of magic that happens when you are still with memory and a stillness as well, I think. And I think that so much of writing, that time where you are just with yourself and you are not necessarily doing anything, but that kind of that sort of magic that goes on in that time of stillness. But I also think it is so interesting that when you find something like some letters, or when I was writing my previous book, The Wild Other, there was parts of that from when I lived in Texas and I'd lived in Russia, and I found lots of notes that I'd made in my 20s. You kind of fall on them like this treasure that you suddenly find. And I think it's, people often say, how do you write? How do you how do you go about it? That thing of, and I've seen Joan Didion writing about this as well, the importance of taking small notes as often as you can, you know, and it doesn't have to be like a paragraph would be a huge amount. It could just be a sentence, it could be a couple of words. And often people say, you know, what advice do you have for people trying to write? I think that thing of just writing down a tiny little trigger in a way. But I also think that there's something interesting that sometimes having too many notes, it's rather like looking at photographs. That's the bit that you remember. And then you kind of may not be able to remember so much of the stuff that's happening on the outside of that as well. I'm so interested by that way that memory works, really.
And the subconscious, I hadn't taken that into account, actually. It's because a lot of mine is factual, obviously. I was sitting here with the catalogs and I had a lot of press clippings, you know, so I had a story, and there was an arc of a story that was already there for me. But I hadn't counted on, you know, I believe in the subconscious as for writing, but I think I've always associated it way more with fiction, actually. But I realized that the subconscious plays a great role in writing anything, actually. And the connections that come out, I was just staggered. Suddenly you see a loop and you say, oh yes, that's right. And it's not like a psychological connection. It's much more intangible than that, actually. I find that really exciting.
You never quite know what's going to come back when, do you? And I think that writing is the stimulus for that. And then some memory will come back to you that you haven't had, not thought about for years and years. By the writing and the process of writing, it seems to lock things sometimes, doesn't it? It's so fascinating.
But then do you sometimes distrust? I mean, I had a very strong sense of something happening, and then I looked it up and I was out I had the wrong year, you know, but I was absolutely certain, you know, that it was when Margaret Thatcher, I believed that I went to work and the person I was working for said, oh, the socialist. And I remember thinking, okay, it's time to leave. And then I looked it up and I had my years, two years out, you know, kind of. So memory is false as well.
Do you think you can, do you think in the act of writing and the kind of beauty of creativity really, isn't it? Do you think you can train your memory to go deeper and go further and go back, you know, or access, it's not necessarily the distant past, it can be something relatively recent, but do you think it's a muscle that you can almost make what, you know, train up, I suppose?
I really, really do, actually. I do. I think it is, you know, it's a craft, obviously, isn't it? Because there's technique and, you know, where do you start and where do you stop? How do you tell the story? All those things are really key. But I agree with you, actually. I think you can, you know, when you said earlier something about how it was difficult to go into a slight trance now because you're so busy with children. And I think that's right. You know, people talk about headspace, you know, all kinds of funny languages, but basically I think it's exactly the same thing. I think it is allowing yourself to sink down into memories or thoughts. And in A.S. Byatt's this wonderful phrase, which is, I write to work out what I think. And I love that so much, because I feel like, you know, it's like you're kind of wrestling words and everything, and you keep bashing them out until you think, oh yeah, that is what I think, but I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
You know, I got to that place. I find that really, you know, that's exciting for me as a writer as opposed to a publisher, you know, because I hadn't experienced that.
Well, sink us down into some of your memories and read us a little bit from A Bite of the Apple, please, Lennie.
Okay, thank you. So I thought I'd read a little bit about Maya Angelou, because partly because she was such a big thing in all our lives, and in mine, but also I loved her. It's about language, how she uses language. In 1984, Maya Angelou came into our lives at Virago. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings had never been published in the UK, despite it being well known in America since its publication in 1969. Maya Angelou told us that her memoir had been sent to British publishers in the 70s, but they'd all turned it down, saying nobody would be interested in the story of a young Black girl growing up in the American South. She loved us for taking a chance on her, characterizing us as her small and feisty English publishers. As we grew to know her, we came to understand that she highly prized courage and loyalty. I've got your back, was something she often said. We published all 7 of Maya Angelou's memoirs, her essays, volumes of poetry, and a cookbook over the next few years. She came often to Britain, and we watched as the country fell deeply in love with her. She captured every size and shape of heart, old, young, ignorant, wise, proud, shy. When I first took her around the UK, I saw that it was as if people were thirsting for her. They drank deeply of her words and felt lifted by her spirit. They flocked to her, at times weeping, literally wanting to touch her hem, at other times shouting with the pleasure of seeing a 6-foot-tall woman dance across a stage, unashamedly, outrageously, sexily, head tipped back with a huge infectious laugh. My mission in life is not merely to survive, but to thrive, and to do so with some passion, some compassion, some humor, and some style, she would say. She was in the mold of the people who inspired her. She was a preacher with a sermon, writing and speaking, as she said, with the rhythms and imagery of the good Southern Black preachers. And she was a teacher with a lesson. I speak to the Black experience, but I'm always talking about the human condition. We are more alike than unalike was her very powerful mantra. Maya Angelou believed in poetry. She trusted in it. And she used to say that she knew from a young age that you could live by its strengths. The grandmother who raised her, and whom she called Mama, said to the little Maya, "Sister, Mama loves you to read real poetry, because that'll put starch in your backbone."
Brilliant.
It's good, isn't it?
I was
it's how language can change, how books can change you, you know, all the things, it feels to me.
Yeah.
Plus so very big and sexy as well.
All things for now, absolutely.
Yeah.
I was lucky enough to meet her just once, and I have never forgotten it.
No, I know.
Never forgotten it. Thank you, Lennie. No, it's really interesting thinking, when I was thinking about your 2 books, I mean, they're quite different in many ways, but there's some striking similarities around the idea of giving birth and nurturing. And you're both creators in a sort of very broad sense. In fact, right at the end of your book, Lennie, it's very striking that you say, I just find the quote, you say, "The excitement of bringing into the world something unique, a book that began as a glimmer of an idea or writing that might give tremendous joy or even create change, that to me is a power of the deepest pleasure." And that there's, you know, it's that idea of bringing into the world. You even describe yourself as a midwife at one point, I think. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that analogy in terms of, because, you know, Clover has some very, very vivid descriptions of actually giving birth, but it felt there's a real synergy in terms of creation.
I think so. I think 2 things. One, I think the editor has to be careful that they're not the center stage. You know, the ego belongs to the author, not to the publisher, not to the editor. So one of the first things to do, I think, is really inhabit the mind of the writer. You know, try, because your job is like the midwife, you know, they've got this vision inside them, and your job is to kind of coach it out of them. But you have to first understand their vision, and you have to first get them to understand that you're trying to understand their vision too, because otherwise they won't trust you. So I do think Sound the Midwife slightly breaks down at this point, but the metaphor. But creating something is very, very difficult, I think. And also the world, you know, it looks like it wants to have a lot of creativity, and it does when it rewards it. Some forms of creativity, but there's a lot of creative people, and it's difficult to make an impact, I think. And so one of the things I think you have to really do as an editor is give an author confidence. You know, you have to, once you've signed up, you know, it's like a love affair in some ways. Once you've signed up with them, you're on their side, you're their advocate, and you must make them believe that you are that person, and you have to give the confidence, because I don't think you can create if you're not confident. So it's holding, you know, I mean, a mother analogy would be would it be a mother? Like, you're holding that person. You're not, but you're allowing them to be their own selves, obviously, but you've got their back, you know. So, you know, it's quite a complicated and very emotional relationship, which is really rewarding when it works.
And it's kind of the role of an actual midwife to give you confidence that you can do this.
That's true. Yeah.
Awful thing that you have to do. I mean, Clover, if I can put it this way, you're a creator of people. You're a creator of words as well, and you seem to find this way of balancing your clear need to do both.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I definitely, in a way, the writing makes motherhood kind of bearable in a way. I mean, I find motherhood so difficult, and I find the loss of identity so difficult. You know, and the way you are kind of subsumed into your children, and you sort of have to be as well. You know, your children kind of in the tussle for power, the children sort of have to win. You don't want to assert yourself. You don't want your life to be more important than theirs. Their lives have to be the most important lives, but you can't put yourself, you know, I couldn't kind of silence myself, I suppose, and put myself aside for them. And being able to write sort of liberates me from domesticity and from maternity, and also makes sense of it completely. And knowing that I have it as a place to escape to and to leave them is absolutely crucial. And I found it interesting because I started writing as a journalist. I started making my living as a writer at 24 when my son was born, and then all the way through my 20s and 30s I did lots of journalism, and I was, you know, writing full time. I did try to write a couple of novels during that time, and I wrote a novel in my 20s and one in my 30s, but neither of those are published. But it is I wrote The Wild Other at 40, I think, and this second book, My Wild and Sleepless Nights, you know, I'm a couple of years ago, and I'm now 45, and I really, really feel that that kind of, for me, that longer form writing, that deeper meditative writing, has been something that I have developed as I've got slightly older, as I've matured as well. And that and all the writing that I did as a journalist is incredible. I love it. I love journalism. I love the human connections of it. I love how sociable it is. I love, you know, it satisfies my extreme curiosity and nosiness about other people's lives, and you know, why we do, how we live. You know, I love journalism, but there is something so deeply satisfying as well in the full immersion in a book, basically, in the big creative project of a book. And it kind of, when I'm going around the you know, the sort of the mundane parts of my life, the school run when the school run existed, but or picking up the laundry from the floor, the fact that I have this big creative project which is going on at the same time, it and Lennie, you were talking about that kind of magic and the kind of the deep magic of it. It exists I sometimes feel like it's a kinetic, when it's working, it's not always like this. You know, a lot of the time I'm feeling self-doubt and anxiety and I don't know what I'm going to write about. But when it's working, it's like a, you know, it's like a moth or a kinetic energy which is living beside me and which is kind of giving me ways of making connections, and it is inspiring me and it's kind of exciting me as I go through the sort of, you know, the mundane in my life. And that feels like a huge privilege and a complete, you know, it's a complete joy. And there is so much about writing a book which is so difficult, sitting in front of the empty page. Am I worthy to do this? What you know, what more can I say? With this book on motherhood, I thought, do people really want to hear, you know, my doubts as a mother? But once you know getting over that, and when that kind of kinetic energy is really firing up, that's when writing is just so, it's so thrilling, it's so exciting, and it's worth the kind of, you know, the self-doubt and torment that comes with it. And the role, you know, the role, as you said, Lennie, the role of the editor is so important as well. And I think that you know, giving confidence is a huge part of it, because the self-doubt can quickly turn to self-sabotage, can't it? And then basically.
I was, I hadn't, you know, because I hadn't experienced them being the writing, but I quite agree. I used to think there were two things sitting here. One was saying, go on, and the other one was like, are you kidding? Is it? No one cares about that, you know. And I had to say, hello, you go to the door now. I'll sit out there. You know, you have to be your own kind of confidence person, don't you? But yeah, and I was very thrilled too. My editor said, I'll read. I said, I got to send you something, because I thought, oh my God, I could be just writing total crap, frankly. So I sent her 12,000 words, and she said, I'll get back to you by Friday. Friday at 6 o'clock, she wrote back and said, yeah, it's good. You're fine. You know what you're writing. I mean, whether she thought it was brilliant or not, no, whatever, but you know, she gave me permission to go on. And I thought, yes, thank you. I mean, I did feel like she had my back. You know, you really, you need a friend in the writing. It's when I say, what I tell, you know, people are writing when they don't have publishers and stuff, you need a friend and you need deadlines. You need somebody to feel, you know, when you're writing to commission, for example, there's someone waiting for your writing. You know, that makes all the difference in the world. And if you don't have that luxury, because obviously most of us don't, you need to invent that. You need a friend or somebody who's waiting for, you know, to catch your writing.
Yeah, and it needs to be real pressure. I mean, I'm doing this piece for the Sunday Times at the moment about, and it's quite a big piece for the magazine about life, how we've evolved as a family. And my editor had said, oh, you know, just do it in a couple of weeks' time. And I emailed her yesterday saying, can you give me an actual date?
Exactly.
Finish this, because otherwise it's, you know.
I know.
So the pressure, the kind of scary pressure, the adrenaline and the focus is important, isn't it? To make you perform, essentially.
Yeah.
What I take from it as well is that even midwives need a midwife.
Yeah, it's easy to lose confidence, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, sadly, we need to kind of, I need to think of a way of bringing this to close, because I just want to keep going down all these avenues. It's so fascinating.
Interesting conversation.
And I think it would be nice to maybe finish, because you're both so immersed in, you know, in these creative acts, as you describe it, you know. The power of stories at this time is something that's been talked a lot about. And there's a passage in your book, Clover, which I kind of can't stop thinking about. You're describing reading to your own children a story that your late mother read to you. And you're saying that what an emotional experience it is. And you saying you can't go back into your childhood. You say, like looking through a keyhole, there's only a tiny glimpse of the past. I know that through the locker behind the door is a beautiful, colourful room full of books, toys, tapestries, and all the rich pictures and patterns of my childhood. I can never reopen the door, but I can push the children into the space. Kind of by telling your story of what's happened in the past, you know, and your story, Lennie, is just so inspiring of what can be achieved. You know, this great creative act of founding this publishing house, which was the only place that would even look at Maya Angelou's work, which, you know, now just seems, I know,
it's amazing,
extraordinary. So do you want to both just finish saying something fairly briefly about, you know, the power of stories at this time? You know, Lennie, you're the publisher of Margaret Atwood, whose work you first championed when you were 17. You know, you recognise the power of her storytelling?
So, well, with Margaret Atwood, and because she was Canadian and we didn't have a lot of famous Canadian writers, so, you know, I was thrilled to find her. And one of the things she said about publishing in Canada when she first started is that a country needs to find its voice. And, you know, the Canada I grew up with was very dominated by British voices or American voices. And Margaret Atwood, Ondaatje, Alice Munro, you know, they started making something called Canadian literature, something we identified as Canadian literature. So to find your voice, a country needs to find your voice, was her sort of mantra. And I would say that's what you feel as a human being too. I mean, obviously wonderful if you can write, but I think the main thing is, for sanity, is to make a narrative of your life. If you can have an understanding of a narrative of your life, I do think that gives you the grounding, and it gives you more than understanding, actually. I think it gives you inspiration and nourishment.
Yes, I completely agree with that. And it's quite odd memoir writing, because you do put a specific narrative, i.e. an actual book within cover, you know, a cover that begins and then ends around a section of your life. And our lives are obviously, you know, big, messy, formless things going on. And I actually found it quite unsettling after my first book, which was also a memoir, was published. This feeling, and I dealt with trauma, and how sort of one of the themes of the book is overcoming trauma, and how I had done that. And at the end of the book, you know, it ends quite optimistically, and so people read it and thought, "Oh, I'm so pleased you've got your happy ending," kind of thing. But obviously, I wasn't particularly happy, and it wasn't the ending. And I think that I also think, although having a sense of the narrative is really, really important, like being aware that when you write memoir, you are kind of creating, it's not exactly a false narrative, but it is creating an ending to a bit of your life, which can be slightly unsettling and slightly confusing. And yet at the same time, I feel it's really, for me, it feels really, really crucial. I'm really interested in writing. I'm really interested in memoir writing. I'm really interested in the truth as much as it's possible to communicate the truth, I suppose. And everything is a heavily edited, filtered, re-remembered, recrafted version of what the truth is like. But I definitely am finding, I mean, I'm sort of into a proposal for another sort of memoir, and for me, that kind of constant seeking the story behind the confusion of your life. I think for me, it's also I'm really, really interested in our emotions and how we live and what we feel and how to communicate those feelings. And putting storytelling is the way of doing that, I suppose. And it feels like something kind of, what was the quote that you said early on? I write to find out.
It was A.S. Byatt. I write to work out what I think.
I think that is such
I write to find out what I think. Yeah.
I love that quote.
Me too.
That kind of, that is exactly, that completely articulates what we're doing, essentially. It's a brilliant quote.
I agree. And it's a writer who gives it to us. Of course.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you, Clover Stroud. And thank you for watching. There's a link on the Stratford Literary Festival's Go's virtual page for ordering Clover and Lennie's books, which you absolutely should do. And other interviews are also available on the page. We hope to see you all at our Winter Festival in November. And in the meantime, please stay safe and keep reading.
Thank you very, very much. It's been a really interesting conversation. I could have gone on. Thank you.
I agree.